In the heart of a military cemetery, where silence should honor the fallen, a single confrontation shattered the peace. Imagine being stopped, accused, and humiliated while holding the ashes of a hero you swore to protect. But the real twist: the woman they tried to silence wasn't just a mourner. She was a general with the power to rewrite the very system that tried to break her. What happens when prejudice meets power, and silence becomes the loudest protest of all? Stay with me, you won't believe how this story ends. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. In the hush of dawn, the mist hanging low over the pristine expanse of Arlington National Cemetery painted a scene almost too serene to bear the weight of the tragedy about to unfold. The March air was heavy with unshed grief, wrapping around the mourners like an invisible shroud. Rows of solemn chairs faced a flag-draped casket resting beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak, its shadow cast long over the ceremony. No one dared to break the fragile silence, not even the wind that whispered softly through the leaves. At precisely 7 o'clock, a black sedan pulled through a side gate, its engine purring low, as though unwilling to disrupt the reverence of the morning. The door opened, and from within emerged a woman of commanding presence. Dressed in a sharp military uniform, her bearing spoke not of arrogance, but of resilience. Her name was Clara Benning, a name that echoed through the Pentagon halls, though not for reasons that would be whispered in today's solemn gathering. In her hand, she held a small, velvet-covered urn, the final vessel of a comrade who had served under her command. This was her duty, a silent farewell to a soldier whose name would soon be etched in marble, but whose sacrifice had already been inscribed in her heart. Clara's steps were slow-measured, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. Mourners turned their heads, subtly recognizing her, not by the rank displayed on her shoulders, but by the unwavering calm in her eyes. It was the kind of composure only forged in the crucible of battle, the unyielding will of someone who had carried wounded soldiers through enemy lines and stood tall amidst the chaos of gunfire. Yet today, that composure was met not with respect, but with suspicion. As she approached the ceremonial circle, a man detached himself from the line of security officers. His face was ruddy, with the flush of authority, unearned, his eyes hard with prejudice. Officer Ryan Haskins was not here to protect the sanctity of the occasion. Instead, he stepped into Clara's path, raising a hand as if to halt a trespasser. "You're not on the list," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice the heavy air. His gaze flicked dismissively over her medals, his smirk curling with contempt. "Who are you to think you can walk here without permission?" Clara's lips parted slightly, not in protest, but in silent incredulity. Without a word, she produced her military ID, holding it out with the precision of a soldier following protocol. But Haskins only sneered, waving it away, like an inconvenient truth. "Fake. They make these look real enough these days," he spat. The words, though muttered, rippled through the gathered mourners like a stone cast into still water. For a moment, the entire cemetery seemed to hold its breath. Mothers clutching children, elderly veterans with medals on their chests, young officers standing at attention, all bore witness to the humiliation. Haskins' voice grew louder, echoing off the silent headstones. "Step back. You don't belong here." But Clara did not move. She did not retreat. Her fingers tightened around the urn, her gaze steady. The silence thickened, pressing against the watchers like a physical weight. In that stillness, something broke. Not Clara's resolve, but the fragile veneer of decorum. Haskins' hand moved to his belt, his fingers brushing the grip of his service weapon. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. A collective gasp rose, hushed, but unmistakable. The sacredness of the funeral was shattered. Children's eyes widened in confusion and fear. An elderly man in a wheelchair whispered hoarsely, "This can't be happening." Yet it was. In the shadow of the flag that draped a hero's coffin, an armed officer was preparing to draw on a decorated general in the heart of a military cemetery. And still, Clara stood unmoving, her presence, a quiet defiance louder than any shouted protest. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. Her silence was a scream reverberating through the souls of those who witnessed. A young soldier at the perimeter hesitated, his jaw tightening as his hand hovered near his radio. But no orders came. No one intervened. They were caught in the paralysis of disbelief, watching the boundaries of respect and honor collapse before their eyes. As the sun inched higher, gilding the mist with a surreal glow, Clara's figure became a silhouette of resilience against the encroaching threat. The air crackled with the tension of unspoken questions. Would he dare? Would anyone stop him? Would justice mean standing still? Or would it mean stepping forward? In that breathless moment, Clara's eyes met those of a young boy dressed in miniature military garb, clutching the hand of his mother. The boy's lips trembled as he whispered, "Why is he doing that, Mama?" His mother's reply was a tearful silence, her grip tightening protectively. Clara's heart clenched, but she did not show it. She knew what was at stake. This was not merely about her honor or her right to stand beside the fallen. This was a battle against a system that had long thrived on silencing the strong, on bending truth beneath the weight of privilege. A sudden gust of wind stirred the leaves, scattering petals from the funeral wreaths. It was as if the earth itself exhaled, bearing witness to the silent war, playing out amidst the graves. Clara's stance was unyielding. The urn in her hands was not just a symbol of loss. It was a testament to her refusal to be diminished. Haskins hesitated, the weight of countless eyes finally pressing down upon him. His fingers twitched, loosening their grip. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, teetering on the edge of an unthinkable precipice. And in that sliver of time, the power shifted not through violence or force, but through the indomitable will of a woman who understood that silence could be the most deafening act of all. The moment hung suspended, a fragile equilibrium of fear and defiance, until the first rays of full sunlight broke through the mist, illuminating Clara Benning in stark relief. A collective breath was drawn, a silent acknowledgement that something irreversible had just occurred. Clara did not step back. She did not yield. And in that quiet, unwavering presence, she ignited a spark that would burn far beyond the silent rows of Arlington. The chill of a brisk autumn morning shivered through the small, whitewashed gravestones lining Mount Hope Cemetery, casting long shadows across the manicured grass. Among them, a single funeral stood out not for its grandeur, but for the silence that hovered like an accusation in the air. The casket of Sergeant Noah Travers, wrapped in the heavy folds of the American flag, sat at the heart of the gathering. Family, and friends, their faces etched with restrained grief, formed a tight circle beneath the towering oaks. Only the quiet murmurs of a pastor's prayer filled the space until the sudden crack of a voice pierced the reverent air. "Stop right there." Deputy Marshal Robert Calhoun's words echoed off the stone markers as he stepped forward from the perimeter, a thick folder clutched in his hand like a gavel. His voice, sharp and unapologetic, caused the honor guard to stiffen and the small crowd to shift uncomfortably. For a moment, all movement stilled. In the midst of the solemn ritual, standing not 20 feet from the casket, was Major General Cassandra Blake. Her uniform was pressed and gleaming, the 4-star insignia on her shoulder, catching the weak sunlight like a challenge. She had come alone without fanfare to honor a fallen soldier under her command, a man whose life had been entrusted to her decisions in the dust and chaos of faraway battlefields. In her hands, she carried a simple urn wrapped in black velvet. Calhoun's voice rang out again, now tinged with a venom that cracked through the veneer of respect. "That's far enough. This is a secured area. You're not authorized to be here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. An elderly veteran shifted uneasily, while a child, in a miniature uniform, tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Is he stopping her from saying goodbye?" His mother squeezed his hand tighter, her own face turned downward, refusing to meet the eyes of those around her. Blake remained motionless, her gaze locked on Calhoun. It was not anger that colored her eyes, but an implacable calm, the kind of steadiness that came from years of standing before decisions few dared to make. Slowly, with the precision of someone accustomed to protocol, she pulled a leather ID wallet from her pocket and extended it toward him. Calhoun didn't bother to reach for it. His lip curled into a sneer, his hand waving dismissively. "I know what those look like. They make them real convincing these days." The silence thickened, pressing in from all sides. A gust of wind stirred the edges of the flag, making it flutter briefly before falling still. Blake said nothing, her hand remaining steady, holding the ID between them, as though offering a truth that could not be denied. Calhoun stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "You can't just walk in here because you've got stars on your shoulder. This isn't your playground." His words, low but cutting, were meant not just for Blake, but for everyone who had gathered an attempt to remind them of invisible boundaries no one dared to cross. A young private from the honor guard shifted his grip on his rifle, his knuckles whitening, but his superior officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Stand down." Blake's voice finally broke the silence, quiet but resonant. "I'm here to pay my respects to Sergeant Travers. Nothing more." Her words should have ended the confrontation, should have reminded everyone that this moment was about the fallen soldier, not about power plays. But Calhoun's face twisted, revealing something raw and unfiltered beneath the badge. "Respect," he spat. "People like you think you can just show up and claim respect." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, and for the first time Blake's jaw tightened, though she did not flinch. The crowd felt the shift, the crack in the mask that had until now kept the ugliness at bay. The mask slipped, revealing the fear and resentment that had festered beneath the surface. He reached forward, suddenly snatching the ID from her hand, with a force that made the urn tremble in her other arm. He held the card up to the light, inspecting it, as though expecting it to disintegrate under scrutiny. Then, with a disgusted grunt, he let it fall to the ground at her feet. The dishonor was clear, but Blake did not stoop to retrieve it. Instead, she stood taller, Her eyes steady her silence, now a form of resistance louder than any words. The crowd shifted again, an unspoken question rippling through them. How far would he go? Calhoun's voice dropped to a growl. You think that uniform gives you the right to stand here? I decide who belongs and who doesn't. His hand moved toward his belt, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The glint of metal appeared as he unholstered his sidearm, the weight of the weapon heavy and jarring in the sacred space of the funeral. A sharp intake of breath swept through the mourners, but no one spoke. No one dared. Blake did not move. She remained as still as the marble statues lining the cemetery. Her calm, a sharp contrast to the weapon now pointed in her direction. Her silence was not submission. It was a defiance that resonated louder than any protest. Then from the back of the gathering, a voice low and steady spoke up. Enough. It was Colonel Henry McAllister, a man known more for his quiet service than for confrontation. He stepped forward, his own uniform bearing the weight of decades, his eyes fixed not on Blake but on Calhoun. This is a funeral, Robert. Not your stage. Put the weapon down. Calhoun hesitated, the gun wavering slightly in his grasp. But the damage was done. The mask he had worn for years of protector of enforcer had slipped irreparably. Now, everyone could see the face beneath, twisted not by duty, but by prejudice. Blake's eyes remained locked on his, unblinking, a silent challenge that demanded he confront not just her, but himself. The cemetery was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves, the quiet sorrow of a nation that had witnessed for one unbearable moment the fracture of its own ideals. And yet in that silence something else stirred, a resolve not born from anger, but from a deep, unyielding demand for dignity. This was not the end. This was the unveiling of a truth too long buried, the first crack in a system too accustomed to hiding behind polished badges and rehearsed lines. Calhoun's hand finally dropped the gun, trembling as though the weight of it had finally become too much to bear. But the silence that followed was not his victory. It was hers. Blake remained standing, the urn cradled in her arms, like a promise, her gaze a mirror, reflecting not just the moment, but the years that had led to it. And though the confrontation ended, the shift it caused would ripple far beyond the cemetery gates, forcing a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The cold clarity of the courtroom echoed the silence that had settled over the country. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but heavy, weighed down by years of unspoken complicity, and the desperate hope that somehow justice would finally have a voice. Cassandra Blake stood at the center of this silence, her spine straight as an iron rod, the polished edge of her four-star insignia gleaming faintly under the sterile light. Robert Calhoun, now dressed in the plain orange of a federal detainee, sat across from her. His demeanor was unchanged from the cemetery, defiant, his eyes like weathered stone, cracked but unyielding. But the illusion of authority he once carried had already crumbled. His name was no longer spoken with respect, but with hushed shame. The man who had pointed a gun at a decorated general during a funeral had become a symbol not of strength, but of a fractured system, unwilling to look in the mirror. Blake's testimony was quiet, precise, and devastating. She spoke not of outrage, but of fact, recounting how she had stood before Noah Travers's casket, holding his ashes only to be stopped by a man whose authority was wielded like a weapon of prejudice. Her voice, steady as a metronome, painted a portrait of a moment too raw to ignore. I did not raise my voice, because it would have done no good, she said. I stood my ground not out of defiance, but because the right to honor a fallen soldier is not granted by permission, It is a duty I carry with me always. Calhoun's attorney tried to interrupt to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, but the courtroom's collective breath held steady. There were no gasps of disbelief, no murmured protests. The audience, the jury, the observers, the veterans who had come from across the country knew the truth before it was spoken. For days leading up to this moment, fragments of the truth had begun surfacing. Internal reports from the police department, complaints long buried and conveniently lost, were suddenly unearthed. Videos old and grainy showed Calhoun's pattern of overreach and aggression. One clip recorded by a bystander years earlier revealed him violently restraining a teenager during a routine traffic stop. His voice sharp and belittling, called the boy uncooperative and a problem in the making. The boy's cries, muffled by fear, echoed across the courtroom as the footage played. A collective shudder rippled through the room. Veterans in uniform, their chests adorned with medals and ribbons earned through sacrifice, clenched their jaws, their knuckles whitening against the smooth wooden benches. Some shook their heads. Others turned away not out of indifference, but because they recognized the pattern too well. They knew what it meant to be disregarded, dismissed, erased. Blake's voice broke through the haze. "This is not about me," she said. "This is about a culture that has allowed certain individuals to believe they stand above accountability. It's about a silence that has enabled not just one man's actions, but a system that rewards intimidation over integrity." Calhoun shifted uncomfortably, his mask of stoicism slipping as the weight of her words pressed into the room. His attorney attempted to salvage his defense, arguing that Calhoun had been acting under stress, that he had perceived a threat in a highly sensitive environment. But Blake's next words sliced through the hollow rationalizations like a blade through silk. A man who draws a gun on an unarmed woman in uniform at a funeral is not defending himself. He is defending his fear of a world where his authority is no longer absolute, where dignity is not confined to the color of one's skin, where honor cannot be tarnished by prejudice. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any ovation. It was a silence filled with realization, with the acknowledgement that this trial was not merely about Robert Calhoun. It was a reckoning for everyone who had ever looked away when injustice wore a badge and spoke with authority. Witness after witness took the stand, former colleagues, subordinates, even civilians, each recounting moments when Calhoun had crossed the line, moments dismissed as protocol or overlooked as minor infractions. A former officer, now retired, testified how Calhoun had once ordered him to falsify a report to justify an aggressive arrest. "I was told it was just part of the job," he confessed, his voice cracking under the weight of years of silence. "I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It always did." Blake's testimony was not dramatic, but it was unyielding. Her refusal to bend to fear in that cemetery had already written her name into the conscience of the country. Now, with each word spoken under oath, she was helping a nation confront the cost of its silence. The final piece of evidence, a letter written by Noah Travers's mother, was read aloud by the prosecuting attorney. In it, she described how her son had admired Blake, how he had often spoken of her leadership, and her unwavering commitment to her soldiers. Her voice, captured in ink and now spoken in the hushed courtroom, trembled with both pride and heartbreak. "My son gave his life for this country," she wrote, and in his final moments, he asked for General Blake to speak at his funeral. Instead, She was denied that right by a man who mistook his authority for justice. The words left the courtroom breathless. Even Calhoun, for all his bluster, could not meet the eyes of the jury. When Blake stepped down from the witness stand, she did so without looking back. Her steps were measured, her head held high, but it was clear she carried not just her own weight, but the burden of every injustice that had been overlooked in favor of convenience or fear. The truth had been unveiled not with shouts or anger, but with the steady, implacable force of dignity. As the courtroom recessed for deliberation, no one spoke. Even the reporters, so often hungry for sound bites and sensational headlines, found themselves silenced by the gravity of what they had witnessed. In that stillness, one truth emerged clear and undeniable. When the mask slips, it's not just a face that's revealed. It's the reflection of an entire system forced to confront its own failings in the quiet defiance of those it tried to silence. And in that moment, as the doors closed behind her, Cassandra Blake knew that the real trial had only just begun. In the days following the trial, the air hung thick with the residue of truths long denied. Cassandra Blake had spoken her truth not for applause or vindication, but to remind a fractured system that dignity cannot be granted, it must be recognized. But it was not her voice alone that resonated in the aftermath. It was the collective silence of a society suddenly awakened to its own reflection. Veterans once stoic in their quiet understanding of sacrifice began writing letters, not to the courts, but to their own families, recounting stories long left unsaid. Stories of how many times they had seen men like Robert Calhoun, men whose authority was rooted in intimidation rather than integrity, allowed to stand taller than they deserved. Of how silence, once a shield against retribution, had become an accomplice to injustice. These letters were not public confessions, but private reckonings folded into envelopes and placed quietly on kitchen tables or tucked into the pages of a favorite book for a loved one to find. The wall outside the courthouse, where protesters and supporters alike had once gathered, gradually transformed. It was no longer adorned with placards and slogans. Instead, handwritten notes, messages of regret and resolution began to appear. A mother's shaky scrawl read, "I once taught my son to respect the badge, but now I teach him to respect the person behind it." A veteran's message penned with the deliberate hand of someone used to battlefield reports simply said, "We knew, and we were silent. Never again." Cassandra returned to Arlington not to speak, but to stand. She visited Noah Travers's grave, standing alone as the wind whispered through the rows of headstones. She didn't bring flowers or medals. She brought only herself, her silence, and her resolve. In that moment, her presence was a quiet defiance of the system that had tried to push her aside, a silent acknowledgement to a fallen soldier that his memory would not be tarnished by the fear and prejudice that had attempted to overshadow his sacrifice. In communities across the country, conversations sparked not by headlines, but by quiet realizations took root. Teachers revised curricula to include uncomfortable truths. Faith leaders spoke not in condemnation, but in confession, acknowledging their roles in allowing silence to prevail. Police departments, under the watchful eyes of their communities, initiated reforms, not in response to protests, but in the face of their own reflection. It was not a sweeping revolution marked by protests or decrees. It was a reckoning in silence, a slow, deliberate awakening that rippled through the fabric of a nation long accustomed to looking away. And through it all, Cassandra Blake remained steady, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of what it means to stand unbowed in the face of fear. Her silence was not the absence of words, but the presence of an unbreakable truth that honor once betrayed can only be reclaimed through the courage to face ourselves. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the weight of truths finally exposed. Robert Calhoun stood before the judge, his posture stiff, his face drained of the arrogance that had once made him feel untouchable. Across from him, Cassandra Blake stood tall, her uniform immaculate, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't there for vengeance. She was there to bear witness to the final judgment, a reckoning long overdue not just for Calhoun, but for a system that had allowed men like him to wield unchecked power for so long. The foreman of the jury rose, paper in hand, voice steady but soft with gravity. We, the jury, having reviewed the evidence and testimony, find the defendant guilty on all charges, including abuse of authority, racial discrimination, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a sacred military ceremony. We recommend the maximum sentence permitted under law. A hush fell over the room. The judge's gavel struck, and the verdict was sealed. Life imprisonment without parole. No shouts of triumph, no applause, just the solemn silence of justice rendered long delayed but finally delivered. Calhoun's shoulders sagged, not in remorse, but in defeat, as though he finally realized that the system he once thought would protect him had turned its back. Cassandra did not look at him as he was led away in handcuffs. Instead, she turned her attention to the people gathered in the courtroom, the jurors, the reporters, the families of veterans, the quiet observers whose faces bore the marks of years of silent indignity. Her eyes held theirs for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't just about her. It was about them, about every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, every injustice that had been swallowed in silence. Outside the courthouse, the wind stirred the flags at half-mast, their colors vivid against the pale morning sky. The steps were lined with people, some holding photos of loved ones lost to injustice, others clasping hands in silent solidarity. They were not cheering. They were bearing witness. They had come not for spectacle, but for closure, for the quiet acknowledgement that even when justice is delayed, it can still be delivered. Cassandra stepped into the sunlight, feeling its warmth on her face. She did not raise her hands or make a statement. She simply stood there, the urn of Noah Travers still held close to her heart. In that moment, she was not a general, not a symbol. She was a person who had stood her ground when the world demanded she bow, and that more than any verdict or sentence was the true judgment. As she descended the steps, the crowd parted, not in awe, but in quiet respect. A child reached out, grasping her hand briefly, before letting go. A veteran, his uniform faded and medals tarnished, nodded as she passed. Each small gesture was a testament to the shift that had begun not through grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but through the quiet, determined presence of someone who refused to look away. The courthouse doors closed behind her, the echoes of the gavel fading into memory. Robert Calhoun was gone, taken into custody, his name destined to fade from plaques and citations. But Cassandra Blake remained her name no longer just a rank or a footnote in military history. She had become a quiet force, a reminder that justice, though it may falter, can find its voice through those who choose to stand firm, even in the face of fear. In the end, it wasn't the verdict that resonated most. It was the silence that followed, a silence filled not with despair, but with the hope that this final judgment was just the beginning of a new reckoning, a reckoning that would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom, into every corner of a nation ready to confront its own reflection. In the story of Cassandra Blake, we witnessed not just the unraveling of one man's abuses, but the exposure of an entire system complicit in silence. From the moment she stepped into the funeral of Noah Travers, a fallen soldier she once led into battle, Cassandra's mere presence challenged the quiet prejudices that had long lingered in the corridors of power. Her silence was not a retreat, but a stance, a refusal to bow to the weight of intimidation, corruption, and racial bias. When Robert Calhoun, a police officer emboldened by a culture of impunity, pointed a gun at her during a sacred military ceremony, it was not just an act of arrogance. It was a final, desperate attempt to preserve a crumbling narrative where certain individuals could still assert dominance over others with impunity. Cassandra's quiet, unwavering resistance sent a ripple through the nation. In standing still, she forced others to confront the ugly truths they had long ignored. The courtroom became a stage not for a personal vendetta, but for a public reckoning, a confrontation between justice and the systemic rot that had allowed someone like Calhoun to rise unchecked. Her refusal to yield or escalate the conflict turned her into an emblem of integrity, not because she sought the spotlight, but because she chose principle over fear. The lesson from Cassandra's story is both simple and profound. It teaches us that true courage does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly holding its ground, even when the world is watching. Her silence was louder than any protest, her composure more defiant than any shouted demand. In a time when so many are tempted to look away from injustice, her story reminds us that real change begins not with words, but with presence, with the simple, stubborn act of standing tall when every instinct says to shrink away. For each of us today, Cassandra's legacy is a call to action. It urges us to be mindful of the small injustices we witness daily, the quiet compromises we make, the moments when we choose comfort over confrontation. Whether in our workplaces, our communities, or our personal relationships. Her story teaches us to find the strength to remain upright, to speak up, and to support those who challenge the status quo. It tells us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's integrity can force a reckoning, can crack the facade of a failing system, and can begin the slow work of rebuilding something more just. If you've been moved by Cassandra Blake's story, if you believe in the power of one person's stand to ignite change, please support our channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Stories that need to be heard, that challenge us to see, to reflect, and to act. Your support gives us the motivation to keep telling these stories that matter. Thank you for standing with us and with those who stand up for justice.